Welcome to Spicy Family Scandals, where real-life drama meets hard-earned wisdom. Today's story is about betrayal, resilience, and the power of standing up for yourself. Let's dive in.
It wasn't the first time I'd heard screaming from my stepmother, but this time, the voice was mine. "How dare you?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the grand living room of my childhood home. My father stood there, silent as a grave, his shoulders hunched like a man who had been defeated long ago. Diane, my stepmother, lounged on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, and a smug smile playing at her lips. "Don't make a scene, Emily," she said, swirling her drink like some soap opera villain. "It's not attractive." "Not attractive?" My voice cracked, hot tears stinging my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You told me I'm not worthy of using my own name at my wedding. You called me a disgrace to this family, and now you're telling me to calm down." "Oh, honey," Diane cooed, leaning forward with faux concern. "It's not personal. It's just that you've never really belonged. And honestly, with the way your life's turned out, I think deep down, you know it too." The venom in her words was so sharp it felt like a slap. I turned to my father, the man who once carried me on his shoulders and promised to protect me from the world. He wouldn't even look at me. "Dad," I choked out, desperate for anything. "Are you really just going to stand there and let her say this to me?" He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples as if I was the problem here. "Emily, your stepmother and we're just trying to protect the family's reputation. You've always been," he hesitated, searching for a kinder word and failing. "Independent. Maybe this is for the best." I felt the ground shift beneath me, like the very foundation of my life was crumbling. "Protect the family's reputation?" I whispered, the words foreign and bitter in my mouth. "By banning me from my own wedding? By telling me I don't deserve to carry our name?" Diane laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Oh, sweetie, it's not like we're banning you. We're just declining to be associated with it. Call it a personal choice." It was in that moment, standing there with my chest heaving and my nails digging into my palms, that I realized two things. One, my father had chosen her, over and over again, and he always would. And two, I would never let either of them hold power over me again. I straightened my back, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You know what, Diane? You're right. I don't belong here. And thank God for that." Her smile faltered, just for a second, and it was the smallest victory, but I clung to it. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out the door, leaving behind the people who were supposed to be my family. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You see, there's something Diane and my father didn't know. While they were busy playing their petty little power games, I'd uncovered a secret. A secret so devastating it could destroy the carefully curated image Diane had built for herself. As I drove away from that house, the weight of their betrayal pressing on my chest, I made a silent vow. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one they'd never forget. And when Diane opened the envelope I'd send her 3 weeks later, she wouldn't just lose her composure. She'd lose everything. The envelope wasn't just a statement, it was a time bomb. But before I get ahead of myself, let me explain how we got there. After that confrontation with Diane and my father, I felt like I'd been gutted. I didn't cry that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was so drained I couldn't. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the apartment Mark and I shared. He tried to comfort me, but even his warm, steady presence couldn't quiet the roar of anger in my mind. I couldn't let this slide. I wouldn't. Diane had spent years undermining me, belittling me, and making me feel like an outsider in my own family. And my father? He was her enabler, always backing her up, always turning a blind eye. They'd taken so much from me. My dignity, my confidence. But not this. I decided then and there. If they didn't want me at my own wedding, fine. But they wouldn't get to pretend they were innocent. The first step was information. Diane prided herself on being the epitome of class and control. But no one can keep their hands perfectly clean. Over the years, I'd overheard whispers, caught snippets of conversations. There were rumors about Diane, about her past, about the things she did before she married my dad. She'd always been careful to dismiss them, laughing them off as jealous gossip. But I knew better. The next morning, I called Lisa, an old family friend who'd been pushed out of Diane's inner circle years ago. Lisa had a sharp tongue and a memory like a steel trap, and she didn't like Diane any more than I did. "Emily," she said, surprised when I called. "What's going on? Aren't you supposed to be in wedding mode?" "Not exactly," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Listen, I need your help. It's about Diane." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. Oh honey, what did she do this time? I told her everything. The phone call, the confrontation, the banishment. By the time I finished, Lisa was practically vibrating with outrage. That woman, she hissed. She's a snake. I've been saying it for years. But no one listens to me. I'm listening now, I said. Tell me everything you know. Lisa didn't disappoint. Over the next hour, she laid out a tangled web of half-forgotten scandals, questionable financial dealings, and more than one indiscretion Diane had swept under the rug. Affairs, tax evasion, even a lawsuit that mysteriously disappeared after she married my dad. It was overwhelming, but it wasn't enough. I needed proof. That's where Mark came in. He worked in cybersecurity, and while he wasn't exactly a hacker, he knew his way around a database. With his help, we started digging quietly, carefully. Old court records, property deeds, social media posts Diane thought she'd deleted. What we found shocked even me. Diane had been living a double life for decades. On paper, she was a philanthropist, a devoted wife, and a pillar of the community. But behind the scenes, she was ruthless, manipulative, dangerous, and she'd made enemies. It was one of those enemies who gave us the final piece of the puzzle. Mark tracked down a former business partner of Diane's, a man named Richard who'd lost everything after one of her schemes went sideways. He was bitter, vengeful, and more than happy to share his story. Diane ruined me, he said during a tense phone call. But she didn't cover her tracks as well as she thinks. He sent us documents, real damning evidence of fraud, blackmail, and worse. Enough to ruin Diane's reputation and possibly land her in jail. I couldn't believe it. After all these years, I finally had the upper hand. Mark was hesitant. Are you sure about this? He asked as we assembled everything into a neat, undeniable package. This could get messy. She's made my life messy for years, I said. It's time she got a taste of her own medicine. And that's how the envelope came to be. 3 weeks before the wedding, I sent it to Diane's house. No note, no return address. Just her name on the front and the evidence inside. I didn't know what to expect. But I didn't have to wait long to find out. That same night, my phone lit up with a call from my father. Emily, he said, his voice shaking. What have you done? But before I could respond, I heard it. Diane's voice, screaming in the background. Not the calm, composed Diane I'd grown up with, but a frantic, panicked woman who knew her perfect world was crashing down. I hung up, my heart pounding. This was just the beginning. The fallout began faster than I expected. The morning after I sent the envelope, Diane's world started to unravel. I hadn't just sent her the documents. I'd also made sure copies went to a few key people. Namely, the board members of the charity Diane chaired, and the accountant my father had been working with for years. Diane had always been untouchable in her circles. But even the most gilded reputations crumble when the truth surfaces. My phone buzzed incessantly that day. Missed calls from my father. Furious texts. Even a few from numbers I didn't recognize, likely Diane's allies, desperate to control the damage. I ignored them all. Mark and I spent the evening sipping wine on our balcony, watching the sunset, when the first real crack in their armor appeared. My father finally sent a message that made me pause. Emily, we need to talk. It's important. Please. The please was what got me. My father didn't beg. Not ever. Mark glanced at the text, raising an eyebrow. Do you want to call him back? I shook my head. Not yet. Let them sweat. And sweat they did. 2 days later, I got a call from Lisa. Emily, you're not going to believe this, she said, practically giddy. Diane's been removed from the charity board. Apparently, there's an investigation into financial misconduct. I laughed out loud, a sharp, cathartic sound. Diane had always bragged about her charity work, how it gave her a platform to make a difference. Now it was all crashing down. But the real victory came that evening. I was cleaning up after dinner when the doorbell rang. Mark went to answer it, and I heard low voices. When he called for me, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. It was my father. He looked smaller, defeated. His normally pressed suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, and his eyes had a haunted look I didn't recognize. Emily, he said softly, his voice heavy. Can we talk? I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. Talk about what? How you let your wife ban me from my own wedding. Or how you've spent the last 20 years letting her treat me like garbage. Please, he said, looking genuinely remorseful. I know I failed you. I know I should have stood up for you. But things are complicated. Complicated. I scoffed. No, Dad. Complicated is missing a recital because of work. Complicated is forgetting a birthday. Letting your wife call your daughter a disgrace and destroy her self-worth. That's not complicated. That's cowardice. He flinched, the words hitting their mark. You're right, he admitted. I've been a coward. But you need to understand. Diane isn't who you think she is. I laughed bitterly. Oh, trust me, I know exactly who she is. A fraud. A manipulator. And if you don't see that by now, then you're as blind as you are spineless. I do see it, he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. Emily, there are things you don't know. Things about Diane, about her past. If people find out. They already have. I interrupted, my tone icy. And that's on her, not me. He stared at me, his face pale. What did you do? I did what you never had the guts to do, I said, stepping closer. I stood up to her. I exposed her for who she really is. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. You don't understand, he said quietly. If Diane goes down, she's going to drag me with her. And there it was. The real reason he'd let her walk all over me for years. He wasn't just complicit, he was involved. Unbelievable, I said, shaking my head. You're just as bad as she is. Emily, please, he begged. Whatever you've done, we can fix it. I'll talk to Diane. I'll make her apologize. Just don't take this any further. I stared at him, the man who had once been my hero, and felt nothing but disgust. It's already out of my hands, I said. You made your bed, Dad. Now lie in it. I shut the door in his face, my hands trembling. Mark came over, wrapping me in his arms. You okay? He asked softly. No. I admitted, my voice cracking. But I will be. That night, I couldn't sleep. My father's words kept echoing in my mind. Diane isn't who you think she is. What did he mean by that? And how far had he gone to protect her? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. The next morning, the real consequences began to hit. I woke up to a barrage of notifications, calls, texts, emails. At first, I thought it was just more fallout from the envelope. But when I saw the headlines, my heart stopped. Prominent socialite under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. Charity scandal. New evidence links chairwoman to decade-long scheme. Diane's name wasn't in the articles. Not yet, but the details were unmistakable. The whispers had begun to spread beyond our small circle. And it wouldn't be long before everything unraveled. Mark leaned over my shoulder, his expression unreadable. You okay? I nodded, though my hands were trembling. I didn't think it would blow up this fast. Diane's been playing a high-stakes game for years, he said. All it took was the right push. I should have felt vindicated. But something about the speed of it all unsettled me. What had I unleashed? By midday, Diane finally called. I let it go to voicemail. But when I listened, her voice was unrecognizable, raw, desperate, and full of venom. You think you've won, don't you? She hissed. You think this is over? You have no idea what you've done. When this is finished, you'll regret the day you were born. I played it for Mark, who raised an eyebrow. She sounds unhinged. She is, I said, but my stomach churned. Diane had always been calculated. Her cruelty wrapped in a veneer of sophistication. This was different. This was panic. And panic makes people dangerous. That evening, my father showed up again. This time, he didn't look defeated. He looked terrified. Emily, please, he said as soon as I opened the door. You need to stop this. I folded my arms, blocking his path. Stop what? Telling the truth. You don't understand, he said, glancing around like he expected Diane to appear out of the shadows. Diane's not going to take this lying down. She's already talking about lawyers, private investigators. She'll destroy you. I snorted. Good luck. Everything I sent out is backed by solid evidence. Let her try. It's not just you she's after, he said, his voice trembling. She's coming for me too. For the first time, I felt a flicker of sympathy. My father looked genuinely afraid, like a man who'd realized too late that he'd tied his fate to a sinking ship. What did you do, Dad? I asked, my voice low. He hesitated, his face pale. I didn't know everything she was doing, but I looked the other way. And when things got complicated, I helped her cover it up. Complicated how? I pressed. He looked away, shame written all over his face. Money. She was funneling money out of the charity into private accounts. When one of the accountants caught on, she convinced me to help smooth things over. I thought it was a one-time thing, but it kept happening. And then there were the lawsuits. My stomach turned. Lawsuits. She blackmailed people to drop them, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Threatened to ruin their lives if they didn't back off. I stared at him, my mind reeling. This wasn't just about petty family drama anymore. This was criminal. Why didn't you stop her? I asked, my voice shaking. He laughed bitterly. You think I didn't try? Diane's resourceful. She always had leverage. On everyone. Including me. What kind of leverage? He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he said, she knows things about me. Things that could ruin my career. My reputation. And worse. My blood ran cold. Worse how? He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. My father wasn't just complicit, he was trapped. And Diane was holding the chains. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. You need to come clean, I said finally. If you go to the authorities now, before she throws you under the bus, they might go easier on you. He shook his head violently. You don't understand. Diane will do anything to protect herself. Anything. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and went pale. She knows I'm here, he muttered, backing away from the door. I have to go. I watched him retreat, my mind racing. Diane was unraveling faster than I expected. But my father's fear planted a seed of doubt. What if she wasn't bluffing? What if she really did have the power to destroy me or worse? As I stood there, the pieces started falling into place. Diane's threats. My father's terror. The speed with which everything was escalating. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. And I had a sinking feeling Diane wasn't going down without a fight. 2 days later, the doorbell rang at 6 a.m., jolting me out of a restless sleep. Mark was already up, peering through the blinds with a look that sent a chill down my spine. It's the police, he said, his voice low but steady. My stomach dropped. For a split second, I thought they were here for me. Had Diane found a way to twist the situation? Was I about to pay for exposing her secrets? But then I saw them leading someone out of the building. It was my father. He was still in his pajamas, his face pale and drawn. As they guided him into the squad car, he glanced up at our window, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment. I couldn't read his expression, fear maybe or guilt. What the hell is going on? I muttered, already reaching for my phone. By the time I got through to Lisa, she was practically bursting with gossip. They arrested him this morning, she said, barely able to contain her excitement. The police are saying he's connected to Diane's schemes. Embezzlement, wire fraud, all of it. I sank onto the couch, my head spinning. My father was complicit. He'd admitted as much, but I hadn't expected this. Diane's world was collapsing, and now it was dragging him down with it. Mark sat beside me, his hand on my knee. This isn't your fault, he said gently. Isn't it? I shot back. If I hadn't sent that envelope. He made his choices, Mark interrupted firmly. You just brought the truth to light. I wanted to believe him, but guilt gnawed at me. My father was paying the price for years of enabling Diane, but he was still my dad. Despite everything, a part of me wanted to help him. Later that day, I got a call from his lawyer. Emily, the man began, his tone clipped and professional. Your father asked me to contact you. He's hoping you'll testify on his behalf. I froze. Testify? About what? His cooperation, the lawyer said. He's agreed to give the authorities information about Diane in exchange for a reduced sentence. But they'll need confirmation that he's been honest with them. I swallowed hard. What kind of information? There was a pause before the lawyer said, It's about Diane's business dealings and her threats. It hit me like a freight train. My father wasn't just covering for Diane. He'd been a victim of her manipulation too. I'll think about it, I said, hanging up before he could press further. That night, as I sat on the couch with Mark, the pieces started falling into place. Diane wasn't just a fraud. She was a master manipulator. She didn't just ruin lives for profit. She controlled people, bending them to her will. And I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. The confirmation came the next morning in the form of a thin, white envelope slipped under our door. It wasn't addressed to me, but I knew who it was from the moment I saw the elegant handwriting. Diane. Mark opened it, his expression darkening as he read the note aloud. Dear Emily, you've always been such a clever girl. Too clever for your own good. But you're not as smart as you think you are. You want to play games? Let's play. Love. Diane. I grabbed the note, my hands shaking. She's threatening me, I said, my voice rising. No, Mark said grimly, pointing to the small flash drive taped inside the envelope. She's showing her hand. We plugged the drive into my laptop, and my blood ran cold as the screen filled with files. Photos, emails, even financial records. All carefully selected to paint me as the mastermind behind her crimes. She's setting you up, Mark said, his jaw tightening. She's trying to make it look like you framed her. I felt sick. Diane wasn't just fighting to save herself. She was coming for me. But as I stared at the files, another thought crept into my mind. Diane was desperate, but desperation makes people sloppy. If she was willing to fabricate evidence, maybe there was something hidden in these files, something she didn't want me to see. Mark, I said slowly, a plan forming in my mind. Can you dig deeper? If she's faking this, there has to be a trail. His eyes lit up with determination. I'll find it. As he got to work, I couldn't help but smile, despite the knot of fear in my stomach. Diane thought she could outsmart me. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The walls were closing in on Diane, but she wasn't going down quietly. For every step forward Mark and I took, she seemed to anticipate it, countering with moves that kept us off balance. The files on the flash drive were damning, but they weren't flawless. Mark spent hours combing through them, and late one night, he found the thread we needed to pull. Got her, he said, his voice sharp with triumph. I sat up, adrenaline coursing through me. What did you find? She overplayed her hand, Mark explained, pointing to a series of metadata timestamps on the files. She forged these emails, but the dates don't line up with the server logs. If we get this to the right people, we can prove she's framing you. It was a relief, a crack in her armor, but it wasn't enough. Diane was cunning, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she'd turned the narrative in her favor. The question was, how far would she go? I didn't have to wait long for an answer. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, a black SUV pulled up outside our building. Two men in suits stepped out, their expressions cold and businesslike. Emily Porter? One of them asked, flashing a badge. My heart sank. Yes. We need you to come with us. We have some questions regarding an ongoing investigation. Mark was at the door in seconds, his eyes blazing. She sent you, didn't she? He spat, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few neighbors. The men didn't flinch. We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, one of them said, his tone clipped. This isn't a request. The ride to their office was a blur of panic and dread. Once inside, they wasted no time grilling me about the contents of the flash drive. They had copies of the forged emails, and they weren't convinced when I told them Diane had planted the evidence. Do you have proof? One of the agents asked, his expression unreadable. Not yet, I admitted, my voice trembling. But we're working on it. Diane, she's been manipulating people for years. My father can back me up. The agent exchanged a glance with his partner. Your father's already implicated, he said. If you have something that clears your name, now's the time to share it. I sat there, feeling the weight of the room press down on me. Diane had managed to turn the tables, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. And unless Mark could finalize the metadata analysis in time, I was in serious trouble. When they finally let me go, my head was spinning. Outside, Mark was waiting, his face a mix of worry and determination. She's pulling out all the stops, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let her, he replied, because this time we're ready for her. Back at home, we set up a war room, piecing together every scrap of evidence we had against Diane. Lisa was a huge help, digging into her old contacts and pulling up more skeletons from Diane's closet. That's when we stumbled upon something neither of us expected. In one of the files Diane had forged, there was a reference to a private offshore account. It didn't seem significant at first, just another attempt to frame me, but Mark noticed something odd. The account number matched one he'd seen in the legitimate financial records we'd uncovered earlier. This is hers, he said, his eyes wide. What do you mean? I asked, leaning over his shoulder. She used this account to move money out of the charity, he explained. But she made a mistake. She linked it to her personal IP address when she accessed it last month. I stared at the screen, the implications sinking in. If we can trace this back to her, we can bury her, Mark finished. It took hours of work, but by the end of the night, we had everything we needed. A clear trail linking Diane to the embezzlement, the blackmail, and the forged evidence against me. The next step was delivering it to the authorities. But before we could act, Diane struck again. A loud crash jolted us awake in the middle of the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding as I heard voices downstairs. Stay here, Mark whispered, grabbing a baseball bat from under the bed. No way, I hissed, following him despite the fear coursing through me. We crept down the stairs to find two figures rifling through our living room. One of them turned, and even in the dim light, I recognized him. One of the men from the SUV. Looking for this? Mark said, holding up a USB drive. The man froze, his hand hovering over something that glinted in the moonlight, a knife. Walk away, Mark warned, his voice cold and steady. Or I'll make sure this gets to every news outlet in the country by morning. The man hesitated, then signaled to his partner. They left without another word, but not before I caught the unmistakable look of fear in their eyes. As soon as they were gone, Mark turned to me. "She's losing control," he said. "And she knows it." He was right. Diane was desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous. But now so was I. It was time to end this. The final blow came quicker than I expected. After the break-in, Mark and I decided we couldn't wait any longer. We packaged the evidence. Every email, every financial trail, every thread tying Diane to her crimes, and sent it to both the authorities and several major news outlets. If Diane wanted a war, she was about to get one on a scale she couldn't control. The story broke the next morning. Charity scandal deepens. Prominent socialite implicated in embezzlement, fraud and blackmail. Unmasking Diane. The double life of a high society philanthropist. Within hours, Diane's name was plastered across every screen, her carefully curated image shattered. The charity she chaired issued a public statement distancing themselves from her, and the authorities announced an official investigation into her dealings. But the biggest shock came when Diane herself was arrested. I was at home when I saw the footage. Diane, stepping out of her mansion in a tailored suit, her wrists cuffed behind her back. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes burned with rage. Mark walked into the room, just as the clip ended. "You did it," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "We did it," I corrected, though my victory felt bittersweet. Because as much as Diane deserved everything coming her way, the fallout didn't end with her. My father was named as a co-conspirator in the investigation. He struck a plea deal, offering full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a hollow win. He avoided prison but lost everything else: his career, his reputation, and in many ways his daughter. Our final conversation was short and painful. He called from a number I didn't recognize, his voice weary and broken. "Emily," he began, but I cut him off. "You made your choices, Dad," I said. "You chose her over me, over everything. And now you're paying for it." "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time I believed him. But it didn't change anything. "Take care of yourself," I said before hanging up, tears blurring my vision. In the weeks that followed, the dust began to settle. Diane faced a slew of charges. And while her lawyers worked overtime to mitigate the damage, the evidence against her was overwhelming. She was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, earning a lengthy prison sentence. Her empire, her influence, her wealth, her perfect image, crumbled to dust. Mark and I, on the other hand, finally got to breathe. With Diane out of the picture, the shadow she'd cast over my life began to lift. The wedding went ahead as planned, though the guest list was smaller and more intimate. Lisa walked me down the aisle, beaming with pride, and as I stood across from Mark, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. But the story didn't end there. A month after the wedding, a package arrived at our doorstep. It was unmarked, but I knew exactly who it was from. Inside was a single note, written in Diane's familiar handwriting. "This isn't over." Mark burned it without a word, his jaw tight. I laughed, not out of fear, but because I finally understood something Diane never would. She could threaten me all she wanted, but she'd already lost. She was trapped in the cage of her own making, powerless to hurt anyone but herself. And I was free.